To speak of currency crashes is to listen to the sound of trust breaking, because long before exchange rates collapse or banknotes become kindling, something far more fragile gives way: the shared belief that money today will mean something tomorrow. Throughout history, currency crashes have never been random accidents or purely technical failures. They have been social events, psychological shocks, and political reckonings compressed into moments of panic. They are the points where the illusion of stability dissolves and reveals what money has always been underneath a promise issued by authority and accepted by faith. And when that faith erodes faster than institutions can respond, collapse becomes not just possible, but inevitable. The earliest currency crashes did not involve paper or printing presses, but metal itself, because even commodity money depends on confidence. In ancient Rome, the gradual debasement of the denarius offers one of history's clearest early examples. Faced with mounting military costs and slowing territorial expansion, Roman authorities reduced the silver content of coins while maintaining their nominal value, effectively taxing the population through inflation. For a time, the system held, because people trusted the stamp of Rome more than the metal inside it. But over generations, the gap between face value and intrinsic value widened until confidence fractured. Prices rose, trade retreated into barter and local exchange, and the currency ceased to function as a reliable unit of account, signaling not just monetary failure, but imperial decline. This pattern repeats because currency crashes are rarely sudden. They are slow leaks of credibility punctuated by violent breaks. Medieval Europe witnessed similar dynamics when rulers clipped coins, altered weights, or declared forced revaluations, each act solving an immediate fiscal problem while weakening long-term trust. Merchants responded by hoarding sound money, demanding payment in foreign coin, or raising prices to compensate for uncertainty behaviors that accelerated the very inflation authorities claimed to be managing. Long before economists formalized Gresham's law societies, lived it, learning through pain, that bad money drives good money out of circulation when trust becomes selective rather than universal. The invention of paper money intensified these dynamics because it stripped currency of any remaining illusion that value resided in substance. When China's Song dynasty pioneered large-scale paper currency, it unlocked extraordinary commercial growth, but it also revealed how tempting monetary expansion could be when constrained only by political will. Overissuance led to inflation, loss of confidence, and eventual abandonment of the system, a lesson later repeated in early modern Europe when states experimented with paper finance to fund wars. John Law's Mississippi scheme in France demonstrated how quickly monetary innovation could slide into speculative frenzy, and how devastating the aftermath could be when paper promises outpaced real economic capacity. The modern era transformed currency crashes from local disasters into national and even global events. Revolutionary France's assignats, backed by confiscated land, collapsed under overissuance and political chaos, teaching a brutal lesson that asset backing means little when governance is unstable. The Weimar Republic's hyperinflation remains the most vivid symbol of monetary collapse, not because it was unique, but because it revealed the human cost. With unbearable clarity, savings wiped out social contracts, shredded, and extremism nourished by economic humiliation. Money did not merely lose value, it lost meaning, and when that happens, societies begin to search for certainty elsewhere, often with dangerous consequences. What unites these crashes across centuries is not technology, but incentives. States facing existential pressure war debt or social unrest repeatedly turn to the same solution, expanding the money supply faster than the economy's ability to absorb it, betting that confidence will last long enough to bridge the gap. Sometimes it does briefly, But confidence is not linear. It holds until it breaks, and when it breaks, it collapses faster than policymakers can react. Currency crashes are therefore less about miscalculation than about overconfidence in the resilience of belief. In the 20th and 21st centuries, currency collapses have continued under new guises, from Latin American debt crises to post-Soviet transitions, from emerging market devaluations to sudden pegs breaking under speculative pressure. Even in systems managed by central banks and floating exchange rates, the same logic applies because currencies remain political instruments tied to fiscal discipline, institutional credibility, and social cohesion. When these foundations weaken, markets sense it before officials admit it, and capital flees not out of malice, but out of survival instinct. Seen through a financial historical lens, currency crashes are not aberrations to be studied in isolation, but recurring stress tests of social order. They expose who bears the cost of adjustment, who controls monetary power, and how unevenly pain is distributed. Elites with assets escape, wage earners and savers pay. Trust once broken takes generations to rebuild, and sometimes it never fully returns, reshaping political landscapes long after inflation numbers fade from memory. To understand currency crashes, then, is not to memorize dates or percentages, but to recognize the warning signs that precede them: persistent fiscal imbalance, political fragmentation, erosion of institutional credibility, and the quiet normalization of emergency measures that become permanent. History shows that currencies do not collapse because people suddenly panic. People panic because currencies have already been undermined for years, and the crash is merely the moment when denial finally gives way to recognition. And it is precisely at that moment, when money stops functioning as a stable bridge between present and future, that societies are forced to confront deeper questions about power, responsibility, and reform. And in the next movement of this story, we must step inside those moments of collapse themselves to see how different societies responded when their currencies failed, which choices led to recovery, which hardened decline, and what enduring lessons investors and citizens can extract from episodes where money quite literally stopped working as intended and became a mirror reflecting the strengths and weaknesses of the systems that issued it and trusted it to hold value across time. Confront those moments of collapse themselves, because what matters most in a currency crash is not the speed of inflation or the depth of devaluation, but how societies choose to respond once the illusion is gone, and money can no longer be relied upon as a stable reference point. History shows that the aftermath of a currency collapse is a fork in the road, one path leading toward reform and reconstruction, the other toward deeper fragmentation and authoritarian control. And the direction taken depends less on economic theory than on political legitimacy and social cohesion at the moment of crisis. In some cases, collapse has acted as a brutal but cleansing reset. After the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany, monetary reform, fiscal discipline, and institutional rebuilding eventually restored stability, though at a terrible social cost that reshaped politics for generations. The lesson was not that inflation could be engineered safely, but that once trust is destroyed, only decisive and credible reform can restore it, often requiring an explicit break with the past rather than gradual adjustment. New currencies, new rules, and new authorities became necessary precisely because old promises had been exhausted beyond repair. Stability returned, not when money was printed more carefully, but when society believed that the incentives governing money creation had fundamentally changed. In other cases, currency collapse hardened decline. When governments responded to monetary failure with repression, denial, or ever more aggressive controls, Economies retreated into informality, barter and dollarization, while political systems grew more coercive to compensate for lost legitimacy. Inflation became a permanent condition rather than a temporary crisis, and money ceased to coordinate economic life effectively. These societies did not simply become poorer, they became fragmented as those with access to hard assets or foreign currency detached themselves from the domestic system, leaving the majority trapped in a shrinking monetary reality. The crash in these cases was not an end, but a prolonged unraveling. What distinguishes recovery from stagnation is not austerity alone or stimulus alone, but credibility. Successful recoveries align fiscal reality with monetary promises, forcing the state to live within constraints that people can observe and believe in. Failed recoveries attempt to restore confidence without altering behavior, relying on rhetoric controls or scapegoats, and history is unforgiving to such strategies. Markets, whether ancient bazaars or modern capital flows, respond not to declarations, but to incentives. And currency crashes are the moments when those incentives are exposed in their starkest form. From an investor's perspective, currency collapses reveal the asymmetry of monetary risk. Inflation is not distributed evenly. It transfers wealth from savers to debtors, from wage earners to asset holders, from the politically weak to the politically connected. This is why currency crises are not merely economic events, but moral ones, because they silently rewrite contracts without consent. Gold hoarding in Rome, foreign coin preference in medieval Europe, and modern capital flight all reflect the same instinct to escape a system whose rules no longer feel fair or predictable. Understanding this instinct is essential because it explains why currency stability is ultimately a political achievement as much as a technical one. Seen across centuries, currency crashes serve as reminders that money is a social technology with limits. It can compress time, mobilize resources, and coordinate millions of decisions, but it cannot substitute indefinitely for productive capacity, institutional integrity, or political trust. When those foundations weaken, monetary innovation becomes a temporary anesthetic rather than a cure dulling pain while worsening the underlying condition. The crash arrives when reality finally overwhelms narrative. The deepest lesson, then, is not fear of inflation, but respect for monetary restraint. Stable currencies are not built by clever instruments alone, but by societies willing to accept trade-offs, pay for what they consume, and discipline those who control issuance. History does not suggest that crashes are unavoidable, but it does insist that denial makes them inevitable. Every collapse studied here was preceded by warnings that were politically inconvenient and therefore ignored until markets enforced the adjustment that leaders would not. If currency crashes throughout history teach us anything enduring, it is that money remembers what politics tries to forget. Debts accumulate, confidence erodes, and eventually the gap between promise and capacity becomes visible to all. At that moment, societies either reform or fracture, and the choice, though constrained, is never entirely removed. Understanding these patterns does not grant immunity from crisis, but it grants perspective, and perspective is often the difference between panic and preparation. In a world where currencies like empires are always more fragile than they appear,